In 1963, a team of archaeologists walked up a bare, sun-baked hill in southeastern Turkey, looked at the broken limestone slabs scattered across its surface, wrote Byzantine-era cemetery in their notes, and left. They were wrong about almost everything. The hill was not a cemetery. The stones were not from the Byzantine period. And the thing they had just walked past would turn out to be older than farming, older than pottery, older than the wheel, and older than writing itself. That hill is called Göbekli Tepe, and more than 60 years after it was almost forgotten, it is still forcing archaeologists to rewrite the story of how human civilization began. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone plateau near the modern city of Sanliurfa, close to Turkey's border with Syria. Its name means potbelly hill in Turkish, a plain, almost dismissive label for a place archaeologists now have jokingly called the 0 point of history. The main structures at the site date to roughly 9,600 BC, around 11,600 years ago. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built about 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge is roughly 5,000 years old. Göbekli Tepe predates both by more than 6,000 years. It was already ancient before the first brick of Egyptian civilization was ever laid. What makes that date so disorienting isn't just a number, it's what the number implies. According to the traditional model of human development, monumental architecture, the kind of large-scale, coordinated building project that requires planning, labor, and social organization, was supposed to come after agriculture. First you settle down, then you farm. Then your surplus food allows some people to stop hunting and start building temples. That was the accepted sequence for most of the 20th century. Göbekli Tepe breaks it. The people who built this site were still hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of domesticated crops or livestock at the time construction began. And yet they organized themselves well enough to quarry, carve, transport, and erect limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, using no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals. They dragged multi-ton stone through open country with rope, timber, and raw human effort, on a scale that some researchers estimate would have required hundreds of people working together. That single fact turns a standard story upside down. It suggests that shared belief, ritual, and social coordination weren't the product of settled agricultural life. They may have been the cause of it. People didn't build temples because they had already formed complex societies. They may have formed complex societies because they needed to build a temple. The 1963 survey team wasn't incompetent. They simply had no framework for what they were looking at. Nothing in the archaeological record at the time suggested that a monumental ritual site this old could exist, so the stones didn't register as anything worth digging into. That changed in 1994, when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, working with the German Archaeological Institute, visited the same hill and recognized what the earlier survey had missed. Schmidt began excavating in 1995 and kept digging for the rest of his life. Under his direction, teams uncover a series of large circular and oval enclosures, each ringed by massive T-shaped limestone pillars. Two taller central pillars stand at the heart of each enclosure, surrounded by smaller pillars connected by low stone walls and benches. The pillars themselves are the strangest part. They are not blank monoliths. Many are carved with the shapes of arms, hands, and belts, the horizontal T at the top functioning as a stylized head, the long vertical shaft as a body. In effect, some of these pillars are enormous stone people, standing in circles, facing inward, watching whatever ceremonies once took place at their center. Around and between them, the stone is covered in relief carvings. Foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, cranes, vultures, and other creatures render with a level of detail and confidence that argues against the idea that these were the first, clumsy attempts of an unsophisticated people. Whoever carved these pillars had already mastered the craft. Schmidt spent nearly 2 decades trying to understand what he'd found. He died suddenly in 2014, having excavated only a small fraction of the site, by most estimates, somewhere under 10% of the total buried structures. He never got to see most of what has come out of the ground since. For years after Schmidt's death, the picture of Göbekli Tepe stayed relatively stable, extraordinary but static. That changed with a series of discoveries across the wider region in 2023, 2025, and into 2026, made by the excavation teams working under Turkey's Taz Tepler. Stone Hills Project, a coordinated government-backed initiative that expanded fieldwork across Göbekli Tepe and a cluster of related sites nearby. The most striking of these finds came from directly inside Göbekli Tepe itself. While clearing soil around a stretch of wall between two of the site's excavated structures, archaeologists found something solid embedded in the stonework, not resting against the wall, not falling beside it, but built into the foundation itself. As the surrounding material was carefully removed, a life-size human statue emerged, lying horizontally, sealed into the wall as if it had been placed there deliberately before construction closed around it. Turkish Culture and Tourism Minister Mehmet Nuri Ersoy announced a find as one of the most significant discoveries to come out of the site in years, noting that similar carved human forms had already turned up at Göbekli Tepe's sister site, Karahan Tepe, but that this particular piece, found in place in context, sealed inside an actual wall, offered something rarer. Direct evidence of how these statues were used, not just what they looked like. That distinction matters. Loose statues tell you a culture could carve the human form. A statue built into a wall, positioned with obvious intention, tells you something about belief. Across many later cultures of the Near East, there's a well-documented practice of placing meaningful objects, sometimes human remains, sometimes figures meant to represent a person or an ancestor, into the foundations of important buildings, binding a protector or ancestral presence permanently into the architecture itself. Whether that same logic applied here, 11,500 years earlier, is something researchers are still working to establish rather than assume. But the placement is too deliberate to read as accidental. Someone chose to put a carved human figure into that wall, and someone chose to close the wall around it. 40 kilometers away, at Karahan Tepe, built by the same broader culture, in the same general period, using the same pillar and enclosure architecture, a second discovery landed almost as hard. Excavators uncovered a T-shaped pillar bearing something that had never been documented at any Taz Tepler site before. A fully realized human face carved directly onto the stone. Not a stylized suggestion of features, but deep-set eyes, a defined nose, and a distinct jawline, rendered with enough individuality that some researchers have described it as reading less like a generic symbolic figure and more like a specific likeness. This wasn't Karahan Tepe's first unsettling find. Back in 2023, excavation there had already produced two extraordinary statues in a single enclosure, a seated human figure over 2 meters tall, broken in antiquity, its upper body found lying separate from its legs, holding its own body in a strikingly naturalistic pose, and beside it, a detailed vulture statue with carved eyes, beak, and wings. The seated figure is considered by many archaeologists to be among the earliest known large-scale, naturalistic representations of a human being anywhere in the world. Taken together with a new face found in 2025 and the human statue sealed into the Göbekli Tepe wall, a pattern starts to come into focus. Across this network of sites, the people of the Taz Tepler culture were not just decorating stone with animals. They were building the human form, sometimes literal faces, sometimes full bodies, directly into the architecture of their most important ritual spaces, again and again, at more than one site, across more than one generation. That repetition is the part that matters most. A single strange statue could be an outlier. A recurring pattern of human figures deliberately worked into walls and pillars across an entire regional network of monumental sites is not decoration. It's a shared practice, which means it was a shared belief. None of this happened in isolation. Göbekli Tepe was never a solitary monument standing alone on an empty hillside. That was simply the assumption for most of the site's excavation history, because it was the only site of its kind that had been thoroughly dug. The Taz Tepler project changed that picture by expanding survey and excavation work across a wider stretch of the Sanliurfa region. What emerged was a network: Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Bonkukla Tepe, Sayburk, Sefer Tepe, and more than a dozen other sites, spread across roughly 200 kilometers, all dating to the same broad window of the pre-pottery Neolithic, all sharing architectural features. T-shaped pillars, circular and oval enclosures, benches, similar relief carving styles, and all apparently connected by the same symbolic and ritual vocabulary, coordinating a shared architectural and artistic tradition across that many sites, spread over that much territory, among people who had no writing, no draft animals, no wheeled transport, and no agriculture to anchor them in place, implies a level of long-distance contact, shared identity, and organized belief that most 20th century models of hunter-gatherer society never accounted for. And still, across every site in that network, only a fraction of the ground had been opened. Göbekli Tepe alone is estimated to hold dozens of enclosures beneath its surface, most of them still sealed under soil that in many cases was deliberately packed in by the people who built the structures in the first place. That detail is one of the strangest parts of the whole site. These enclosures weren't buried by time, erosion, or accident. The evidence at several structures shows they were intentionally backfilled by the very people who used them and then abandoned. Nobody fully agrees on why. It may have marked the ceremonial retirement of a structure once its purpose was fulfilled. It may have been protective, a way of sealing something in rather than keeping something out. Whatever the reason, it means that what's still underground at Göbekli Tepe wasn't lost. It was put there on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and chose not to tell us why. One of the most heavily debated pillars of the entire site is Pillar 43, nicknamed the Vulture Stone. It shows a vulture with a disc-like shape positioned near its wing, set among a dense field of other animals, including what some researchers interpret as a headless human figure near the base of the carving. In 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Demetrius Sakritsis proposed that the imagery on Pillar 43 might function as a kind of symbolic record, possibly encoding the approximate timing of a real astronomical event using animal figures as stand-ins for constellations. Their hypothesis links the pillar to a genuinely significant period in Earth's climate history, the Younger Dryas, a sudden sharp cooling event that began roughly 12,900 years ago and lasted for around 1,200 years, abruptly reversing a warming trend and plunging much of the northern hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated among climate scientists. One hypothesis proposes that fragments of comet exploded in the atmosphere or struck the Earth, triggering the sudden shift. It's an active area of scientific research, not a settled conclusion, and the idea that Pillar 43 specifically records this event is even more contested. One interpretation among archaeologists, not a consensus finding. What's less speculative is the timing itself. The earliest phases of construction at Göbekli Tepe fall not long after the Younger Dryas ended, in a period when these communities would have been living through, or in recent cultural memory of, one of the most abrupt climate disruptions in the archaeological record. Look again at what's actually carved into these pillars, and that context starts to feel less like background noise and more like the reason the site exists at all. Hundreds of individual animal carvings, rendered across dozens of pillars, depicting species that were central to the diet and imagination of the people who lived through that era: foxes, aurochs, wild boar, cranes, snakes, scorpions, carved again and again with obvious care in a period when the natural world around these communities was in visible upheaval. It's reasonable to wonder whether at least part of what's happening on these stones is an act of memory, an attempt to hold on to a version of the world that was disappearing, preserved in material that could outlast the people carving it. Nobody has a single confirmed answer for why Göbekli Tepe exists, and it's worth being honest about that rather than pretending otherwise. What has emerged instead is a set of overlapping, non-exclusive theories, each supported by different pieces of evidence. And most researchers now think the real answer probably involves more than one at once. The first is ancestor veneration and mortuary ritual. Human bone fragments have been recovered at the site, and some researchers have proposed that it may have played a role in funerary practices, possibly including excarnation, where bodies were left exposed to the elements and scavenging birds before the bones were collected and curated elsewhere. The prominence of vultures across the site's carvings fits uncomfortably well with that idea, though it remains an interpretation rather than a proven practice. If human statues really were built into the site's architecture as stand-ins of the dead, or for specific honored individuals, that would tie the buried statue at Göbekli Tepe and the faces at Karahan Tepe directly into the same framework, a place where the presence of specific people, living or dead, was meant to be permanently anchored into the stone. The second theory treats the site as a kind of memory infrastructure, a place built to hold and transmit knowledge across generations in a world without writing. Carving is slow, deliberate, and durable in a way that oral tradition is not. If the animal and symbol carvings really do encode information about seasonal cycles, star positions, or remembered disasters, as the Vulture Stone debate suggests they might, then structures like this could have functioned as something close to an early archive, a way of making sure that hard-won knowledge about the world didn't die with the individuals who first learned it. The third theory is social. Building something this large required cooperation on a scale that hunter-gatherer bands rarely needed before. Groups that might otherwise have stayed small, mobile, and separate had to come together, share labor, and share belief long enough to complete a shared project. That kind of coordinated effort tends to forge identity. In a period of serious environmental stress, when the old certainties about food and climate were breaking down, a shared building project, something everyone contributed to and everyone had a stake in, may have functioned as social glue, holding a wider regional population together through a genuinely dangerous stretch of history. The fourth theory is the least comfortable one, and it's suggested less by any single artifact than by the pattern across all of them: control. The layout of the site, the way certain carved symbols cluster in specific enclosures and not others, and the presence of individualized human faces and figures all point toward a society that wasn't perfectly flat or egalitarian. Someone decided where the pillars went. Someone decided which animals to carve where. Someone had the authority to organize hundreds of people to move 20-ton stones. That kind of coordination generally requires leadership. People whose knowledge, status, or claimed connection to the sacred gave them influence over everyone else. If that's accurate, then Göbekli Tepe may represent one of the earliest physical traces we have of organized social hierarchy, a ruling or priestly structure that predates cities, kings, and writing by thousands of years. These four explanations aren't in competition with each other. A site can be a memorial to the dead, a repository of hard-earned knowledge, a source of communal identity, and a tool of social organization all at once. Most enduring sacred architecture throughout human history has managed to be all those things simultaneously. The most important thing to understand about everything described here is scale. Every statue, every carved face, every debated astronomical theory, every argument about ritual and hierarchy, all of it has come from a small fraction of the site. Estimates vary, but by most accounts, the majority of Göbekli Tepe's buried enclosures remain unexcavated, sealed under soil that in several cases was deliberately placed there by the people who built the site thousands of years before anyone thought to wonder what they'd left behind. That work is also under real pressure. A protective roof structure was built over parts of the site to shield the exposed stone from weathering, and while it has undoubtedly helped preserve the pillars from rain and sun damage, some archaeologists and conservators have raised concerns that it also alters humidity and airflow around the stone in ways that could accelerate deterioration over the long term. A genuine and ongoing tension between protecting a site and disturbing the conditions that preserve it for 11,000 years. In the first place, Klaus Schmidt used to describe the people who built Göbekli Tepe not as primitive, but as capable of something modern archaeology had badly underestimated: intention on a timescale longer than a single lifetime. He believed, based on the deliberate backfilling of the enclosures, that the builders weren't hiding the site so much as preserving it, sealing it carefully enough that it could survive far longer than anyone standing there in 9600 BC ever would. He spent nearly 20 years trying to understand what that intention meant, and he died before the buried statue in the Göbekli Tepe wall, the face at Karahan Tepe, or the full scope of the Taz Tepler network had come to light. He never got to see any of it. What's left underground at Göbekli Tepe isn't empty space, waiting to be filled in by imagination. It's a set of decisions made by real people roughly 11,500 years ago, in the aftermath of a climate crisis that reshaped the world they knew. Decisions about what to carve, what to bury, what to seal away, and what to leave standing in the open for anyone who came after them to find. Less than a tenth of that record has been read so far, and what's already been recovered has been enough to move the starting line of organized human civilization back by thousands of years. Whatever is still sealed under the hill was placed there by people who, by every indication, meant for it to last. It has. The only open question left is what happens when the rest of it finally sees daylight.